Hello, and welcome to CoOp Cast, where game designers Peter Goosis and Michael Kelly talk about cooperative board games. Join us each week as we break down one game and have a related design discussion. Hi, I'm Peter, and I'm here with Mike.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of CoOp Cast.
It's a very special episode. In this episode, we're talking to Matt Leacock.
Yay! How you doing, Matt? Thanks so much for being on the show.
Hey, doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're recording live from Unpub, so if the sound quality is a little different from what you're used to, that's why. It might be echoey a little in the room here.
We're actually all here together. How unusual is that? Usually we're recording over the internet.
All right, so without further ado, Matt, we're here to talk today about co-op games, something you might know a little bit about.
Tiny bit. Yeah, so if you don't know Matt Leacock, he's designed a few games you might have played. What are a few, Matt? I'm not even...
Probably best known for Pandemic, but I've also designed the Forbidden series and Thunderbirds.
Yeah, so, small indie hits there, right? Just,
Well, Thunderbirds is a little more indie.
Yeah.
Pandemic's a little
No, that's true. I'll give you that. But yeah, some of the, I think, most successful and some of our favorite co-ops of all time. So, again, fabulous to have you on the show. Thanks for making time for us at Unpub this year.
Yeah, so we've already talked in one of our episodes specifically about Forbidden Island. And Forbidden Island has, for I think both of us, this made our number one spot, one of our favorite mechanics of all time. In Pandemic, when you're flipping over a card, you're adding cubes to the board. But in Forbidden Island, you're actually removing tiles and cards from the deck, which really ramps up the tension as the game goes on. I don't think any game has actually matched that ramp up of tension. How did you come up with that mechanism originally?
Well, I mean, it does riff on Pandemic's engine in that as you're reshuffling, things that are bad get worse. But I just got kind of a visceral thrill playing with the game, seeing the island shrink. I mean, I think I was influenced a little bit by the game Survive that I played as a kid.
Okay,
that's like maybe 30 years old now. I mean, it's
although that reprint that came out a few years back revitalized that one. Yeah, no, Survive's a great game.
I mean, I just remember that island shrinking, and I captured some of that there. But the fact that you really have to kind of try to stay dry and stay in the highland just felt exciting to me when I was playing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's one of our favorite things about the game, again, is the increasing tension. So obviously that's important in all co-op games. And I mean, is that something you strive for at the beginning, is starting out at a certain level of tension and changing the level of tension as the game goes on? Do you want to see an arc?
Yeah. I mean, really, you want sort of waves of fear and then hope. You can't just have it. You can make it relentless. The players kind of get exhausted. So what I found with that card engine is that things get really, really bad. You get a little chance to catch your breath, and then they get worse. But all along, the overall story is getting grimmer and grimmer at an accelerating rate.
Right.
And I think Forbidden Island also has this thing that Pandemic doesn't, which is you do all your melds, you get all your treasures, but then you've got that moment of, get to the chopper. It's sort of like the second kind of climax where you're not sure you're going to make it off the island or not, and it's got this nice finish that I think is even more refined than Pandemic.
Yeah, my just a little personal share besides the Predator quote there. My son, my 5-year-old that I play Forbidden Island with a lot, whenever we win, he makes me, I have to put the helicopter card down on the table and place all our pawns onto it and then carefully lift it up, and if we fall off, we don't win the game. So it's just the whole reflex aspect that's added on at the end.
It's a dexterity challenge at the end of Forbidden Island.
Oh, but yeah, the thing I bundle a helicopter with the game.
There you go.
There you go. Hey, well, I guess you can use the flying ship from Forbidden Desert, maybe. The thing that you said that kind of jumps out at me the most, and it's not a problem with your game, but it is something that I see in a lot of co-ops, and I think even in one of the ones we designed, Salvation Road, the idea of exhaustion, I think, is a really something to think about and kind of a danger of co-op design. There are many co-ops I've played where I feel actively depressed almost by the experience and kind of crushed by the game. And yes, I guess in sort of, from a video game perspective, in a Dark Souls way, or Ghost Stories, one of those kind of games where you expect it to be hard, and that's sort of the draw, that can be good. But yeah, it also can be a really negative thing when you just see, as you said, you need to have some hope, and when you see no hope in a game whatsoever.
Yeah, there's 3 things there, I think. I mean, one is you need to have hope, you need to be able to catch your breath, and I don't think it should be a grind. Just to mention Ghost Stories, for example, I think technically it is impossible to win during the first, maybe, it's been years since I played it, but during the first 3/4 of the game, you're just trying to get through those cards.
You're right.
So you get to the point where you could potentially win, where I think it's more satisfying if you can play and, maybe you get really lucky and maybe you can unlock an early win. At least there's some hope for it. It's like a more open design space rather than we're going to make you grind through this deck before you can ever have any chance of unlocking a win.
Sure.
And do you think something that might help with that is things like campaign games or these dungeon crawl type games where you're getting equipment, your characters are getting better as you're going along, and even Pandemic Legacy, from game 1 to game 2, you're getting better. Do you think something like that can help with the grind, or do you think that's just another way of masking?
I'm trying to think I guess when I talk about the grind, it's sort of like, well, we've got this certain amount of work that we need to do, and it's got this goalpost, and until you, or this line, and until you cross the line, you really can't start on your final goal. Something like that. I was just sensitive to that when playing Ghost Stories in particular, because I knew that there was just no chance of getting a win until we crossed that one threshold.
Right, until you get to the last 10 cards.
Yeah, the equipment and stuff I think is interesting because it's sort of like this toolkit that you can use to creatively solve problems, both in the Legacy games and in Forbidden Island. It's really like MacGyver style, how can we cobble together some sort of crazy plan in order to secure a win?
I would say there's potentially a minor grind in base Pandemic and Forbidden Island in that you do have to progress through the player deck to get the cards you need to meld.
Yeah, that's true.
And I thought it was a very interesting design decision in Forbidden Desert where the players have a much more active control over when they get those pieces. Now, yes, you have potentially the luck of the draw of where not playing Forbidden Desert, you're trying to find the intersection of the different parts of the flying craft so you can escape the desert. So could you discuss kind of the choice there, sort of, minor grind versus kind of no grind at all, and you can let just the desert run away with the board and potentially kind of rush to the pieces of the airship if you want to.
Yeah, well, in Pandemic, I'm trying to create enough local emergencies that you're like, okay, well, we have to trade off between firefighting and doing the strategic objective. And we want to make sure that there's enough crisis on the board that you always kind of feel like you have to keep an eye on that. And if you don't have the cards you need, well, you know what you need to do. You need to go kind of put out fires.
Yeah.
And then, then there's that sort of inflection point where you might want to lunge for the victory, knowing that you're risking local crises around the board and hoping that you get enough runway in the outbreak track in order to accomplish that. So I'm hoping to kind of hide that where you're waiting for the cards to arrive because there's so many other things you can focus on.
Well, to be fair, I guess you're never really 100% waiting. Because you have the option of trading, it's just that's using up so many actions, and it is the trade-off. I guess Forbidden Island is slightly more pronounced just because you go through the player deck so many times, whereas Pandemic, you're getting a nice mix of those cards over time. I love Forbidden Island for that. But sometimes I'll be like, this is going to be a hard game. We didn't get 2 artifacts before we went through the player deck the first time. You can sort of see how the feel of the game is going to be based on the matchups you get as you go through that first time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and there's some agency as well in the players, when they decide to solve those things. Because as you're getting to the end of the player deck, you may make decisions you wouldn't have made in Pandemic, for example. You never get that shifting point where, the deck reshuffles. So you never even have that decision, should I hold on? With Pandemic, a lot of times it's, can I get to a research station to be able to cure a disease? But in Forbidden Island, you have more of that decision.
Yeah, they're a little fuzzier. I mean, some advanced players will look to see, okay, well, when do we expect that next epidemic to show up? Can we do some high risk activity before we know that we're going to get caught by that?
That's true, although as you get more advanced and put more epidemics in the deck, they come every other turn, it feels like.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, the highest difficulty settings.
So I was talking a little bit about leveling up, and it feels like in Pandemic you're doing that, though, because speaking of those research stations, at the beginning of the game you have 1 research station on the board, and as the game goes on, you're actually adding research stations to different places on the board, which helps you move better. It helps you cure diseases better because obviously you'll be closer. You spend less actions moving back and forth to get to those research stations. Was that something that came in the design pretty early, or did that take you a little while to get to?
About halfway through, just experimenting with what other types of actions could be added. And I latched onto that and kept it right away because it's sort of like these milestones that you can achieve halfway through the game where you get a sense of progression and you're visibly constructing something, and it makes you feel like the story is continuing and building on itself. In the same way that diseases have that effect as well. You can see the threat building up over time, sort of in a negative way, and it's very visceral. You can, and the sand in Forbidden Desert and the lack of tiles in Forbidden Island, you can glance at the game and see, oh, wow, things are bad, right?
You can kind of see the game state. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a hallmark of good co-op design in general. And again, kind of contrasting with the grind. No offense to Ghost Stories. We had very positive things to say about that in our recent review. But that game could be potentially a little samey as you progress through, like you're doing the same kind of actions. Whereas something like Pandemic, it's almost like the game, a lot of good co-ops progress through phases, I guess. So Pandemic, you've got the early game where it's very hard to move, and at the same time, things aren't too dire. You aren't adding too many cubes at the end of each turn. And then by the end, I guess you've progressed to where your capabilities are much greater. You can move around the board more quickly or remove cubes more quickly because of the cures. But the deck is also kind of racing you, and the cards are coming out a lot faster. I compare it to, have you played Spirit Island yet?
I haven't tried that yet, no.
Yes, Spirit Island, I would say, has a very similar thing. It's this kind of desperate fight to even hold on because, you're these spirits defending an island against colonial invaders. At the very beginning, they're like all over the island, but late game, you go to this very different field where you have all these powers that you can bring to bear, but they're also kind of increasing their pace. So I think a lot of good co-ops kind of have that feel of progressing through stages or phases or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's almost like acts.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. I don't know if you get asked this in every interview, but usually when we have guests on, we kind of ask about their gaming history, how you got into the hobby.
Well, I was going to ask actually specifically about co-ops. Like, I know you're now known for making co-ops. Is that something you originally went in for? Is there something about co-op design that drew you into it? Or was it something that evolved like, well, now I made Pandemic, everybody expects me to make a co-op?
No, I played Reiner Knizia's Lord of the Rings back in 2000.
Yeah.
And I played it with my wife, and we both really enjoyed it. And I really love the fact that it didn't matter if we won or lost. We had a good time, and it's just a very positive experience being able to win or lose with her in that game. And it seemed like an interesting challenge to come up with a cardboard artificial intelligence kind of enemy. So I went for it and designed this one, and it kind of took off. So and it was a fun challenge, so I just followed it up with others. I'm fortunate that I've been able to do more.
No, absolutely. Yeah, man, Lord of the Rings, I think that was my first kind of introduction to the co-op genre, too.
I've still not played that one.
You haven't played? Wow.
I've never played. Don't take away my co-op cred. I did play Pandemic, though, right when it first came out, because I was actually demoing for Z-Man games at the time when it first came out. And I kept going to my local game store, and they kept yelling at me because I couldn't get them Pandemic, right? Like, it's like, I'm just demoing the game, people. I don't even work for the company, right? I don't have a copy yet, It's one of those situations. Like, every time we get this game in, it sells right out again.
Yeah, how many times have you taught Pandemic, if you had to guess?
Hundreds and hundreds. Because it was very popular. It was funny because Z-Man was kind of in their heyday at that time. Because Agricola had just come out.
Yeah.
Pandemic came out. They had another one, too, that took off. I'm trying to remember what it was. But it was like there were 3 big games that kind of came out from Z-Man all around the same time. And it felt like those were the 3 games people were asking about. And it must be hard even as a publisher because you keep coming up with new games and like nobody wants to hear about them. They want to ask about your other 3 games.
That's a nice problem to have, really.
Well, sure.
Of course.
That's true.
Zeb at the time was doing like 40 games a year or something.
He was.
Crazy because he was a one-man shop. So, yeah.
Yeah. He was. And I feel like that's the way the game market is now for everyone, though. It's like there are how many 4,000 games released in a year? And how many do you really hear about? 10? 15? If you're a casual gamer that's just looking on BGG every once in a while to see like what the new hotness is, how many of these games survive every year?
It's again, though, I think it's a great problem to have, comparing the hobby. When I first got into kind of the more hobby gaming market, what was there? There was Settlers, there was Carcassonne on kind of the Euro side. You had Steve Jackson games and Great War games, Avalon Hill, that kind of stuff. And now the fact that, if you can find any kind of theme you might like, you can find any mechanic you might like, you can find probably 20 games with that theme or mechanic. I think it's it's amazing how the hobby has grown. Now we're having some growing pains in that it's hard for anything to get traction, I guess, unless you have a great system like Pandemic to kind of build on. But yeah, it's a good problem. I'm glad the hobby is growing and kind of getting more mainstream media focused.
Used to be able to just play everything that came out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Like everyone
say, okay, well, what did Mayfair import? And
it's a lot like. Not that I guess any of us were alive for this, but, back in the 50s and 60s, like the birth of television, like everyone watched the same 3 TV shows. And you could go into any restaurant and be like, hey, so how'd you like this? But now, now if you look at the best games from last year, probably if we all added up our plays of games, we would have only played 10% of them, and maybe only a few of the biggest ones. It's interesting, kind of the diffusion of the hobby overall.
Well, I think of it like book publishing, even. Yeah, it's not like you expect to be able to read every book that comes out every year, but there's a huge diversity, and people who really love one particular kind of thing can go find their thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's the benefit of us focusing on co-ops and you focusing on co-ops is, you find something that you love and you can keep in that same niche, right? You can stay doing the same things. And I think as a designer, too, kind of getting back to the design discussion a little bit, I think as a designer, the more you do something, the better you get at it. Like, have you found designing co-ops now to be easier than when you were first at it? Or do you still run into some challenges where you're looking for, okay, how do I get past this design hurdle?
Yeah, I found designing games in general to be easier because I do competitive games as well. I do find cooperative games, though, quite a bit easier. I don't know what it is exactly. I think it's because of the research methodology that I use is so much better suited or more natural to me with co-op games because I'm watching people record themselves and you get such a richer channel of information when you've got people arguing and talking with each other because they're all talking and you kind of get a view into what's going on in their heads. And if you're watching competitive players play each other, you just see like silence.
They're keeping
staring at the board,
hidden.
and it makes me nervous. It's just like, are they enjoying themselves? And I actually do have to kind of ask them sometimes. I see them leaning in, and they'll be like, "Oh, that was really fun." And I'm like, "I'm glad you told me that because I have no idea, whether you're enjoying yourselves or not." I have to pick up on those signals a little bit more, because I have to build a whole new way of watching people play competitive games than cooperative games.
And I find, and I've listened to you talk in the past in other places about how you like to watch people record. And I know I've heard you talk about it too, how you don't like to guide people through their playtest experience. You like to watch them as they experience it, dealing with the ups and downs, not helping them with those challenges. And that way you can see if it's a sticking point for one group or many group, or, if everybody's hitting the same sticking points. I'll be honest. I mean, that is something that is very hard for me as a co-op designer to sit there and watch people not being able to figure out like what to do. And you're thinking in your mind, oh, it's so obvious. It's that.
Yeah. What helps is the U.S. Postal Service. You put it in the mail. You're not in the room. Yeah. I mean, you can give them your phone number and they can text you if they get totally stuck. But yeah, I mean, just not being in the room helps so much. And nowadays everybody's got these cell phones in their pocket and they've got a video gear there and they forget about it. A lot of times they just completely act natural. And it's so much better than it was when I was doing user experience design research, in Silicon Valley. You had these big cameras and labs and all this theater, which really took you away from a natural.
Right, it wasn't a natural.
It wasn't natural. Yeah, here they're playing in their living room, Right. And they've got some phone propped up on something that they carry with them all the time. So it's much easier for you to feel like a fly on the wall.
That's really fantastic. We did a little bit of that with Salvation Road, some blind play testing, and I think we had it was only a couple. We didn't have. I'm sure you probably have deeper and larger play testing groups than we do, but we had 2 or 3 groups record themselves, and it was painful sometimes. Like in the process, we're like, "Oh, this game's great. Everyone's going to understand these rules. Yeah, it totally makes sense." And then they're 2 different groups play a major rule 100% wrong. Yeah. You're like, so we didn't write that very well.
The pill for hubris. Yeah, it's great for building up empathy and understanding. And boy, you really feel motivated to fix the problems when you watch people suffer at a distance.
Right. Well, especially if it's something you created, right?
Yeah,
you have that personal attachment to it. It's like, oh my gosh, I've just failed these people.
Or if the balance is wrong and it's like crushingly hard, you see people just struggle because they feel like they're doing something wrong or they're just not smart or whatever. You really jump on that.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we're here at Unpub. It's funny you mentioned balance because I did take a game which I knew the balance was off to one of these Unpub minis. And I went there and I said, you know what? Every piece of feedback I'm going to get is on the game balance. This is too easy. This is too hard. I can't remember. I think it was too easy at the time. And it's like, no sense of tension. And with a co-op game, it's really important to get that right. If you don't have that level of tension, and I mean, when you do get it right, it's amazing the difference in feel for players. They're like, wow, that was great, versus literally the same mechanisms. They're like, yeah, I don't know. And I think, and the hard part about co-ops is you can't make it the same every time, right? So you can't design this script that will run people through. And I guess games like Time Stories try to do this, right? Where you got this one run through. But a lot of times we're building games for replayability. And part of the problem with that is there's randomness involved in that. Or you have to add some level of randomness, because if there's none, then there is a prescribed way to get through it.
Yeah.
And so part of the hard part is, what if that first game they get is super easy? Or what if that first game they get is super hard? Now they feel crushed and don't ever want to play it again. Or, wow, I just walked through that. Well, no reason for me to play this game anymore, right?
I beat it. That's it.
Yeah, and so it is an interesting balance, and it is something we have to do as designers. I mean, I wonder if there is a way to overcome that first game hurdle. What if you get this swingy game one way or another as your first game? Or do you as a designer think, well, I'm just going to try to balance it tightly toward the middle? So
you really can't do that. I mean, like Forbidden Sky, for example, a design I'm finishing it right now, it's got a really wide audience. We got people who love desert and are like hobby gamers and really into extremely hard experiences, challenging, gamey, crunchy kind of stuff. And then you've got, 10-year-old kids who are playing with each other. And it's a really wide group. So we're basically just trying to include 4 different difficulty levels and offer just at least some tips. Like, hey, if you've played these other games, you might want to start here. If you've never, done a game before, start here. And it doesn't, economically, rule-wise, that doesn't take a whole lot of text to offer it. But it's pretty important to the experience that you self-select appropriately on that first play.
Yeah, and we've actually started doing that ourselves. We started looking at, we always had different difficulty levels, but the first game we came out with, Salvation Road, it started you on hard difficulty level, and it called it normal. And it ruined players' experience the first time, because they said, well, I don't think this game is beatable. Not, I need to learn more to get to that next level of understanding. We set it up hard to begin with, and that was the decision we made with our publisher. And like, okay, this is where we want the game to be. But now we're starting calling those easier levels easy, and if you choose to play on hard level yourself, you've made that choice going in.
Yeah.
And I think players can tolerate that a little bit better.
Sure. If you select a difficulty level that says legendary, you don't necessarily
if you start on the highest
right?
level of Forbidden Island,
and if you call it novice, that was a word that we shied away from in pandemic, because we wanted people to start on intro. But if we called it this is Tom Lehman's doing, he basically got some research from people. If we called it novice, then no hobby player would start at novice.
Yeah.
And we actually did want people to start there, because it's a pretty challenging game.
Sure, absolutely.
So we called it intro. So that was sort of like the way you're supposed to play the first time. But with the Game Right games, novice was a better fit, because you're playing with kids, and it just seemed like
that makes sense.
So the terminology matters quite a bit.
Yeah, and that is true. And whatever level you decide to set it at matters as well because of that, and like what you call it. We had this discussion with Liz from Beyond Solitaire, where she said, if you call something like, I'm way too wimpy to come in here, nobody's going to play at that level, right? So it's not really a true level, because no one's going to start at the I'm way too wimpy to play this game level. Yeah. So I do think it is important to have some kind of an intro mode and things like that. Now, what do you think about increasing complexity as players get better at your game? Introducing new elements, I guess similar to a Pandemic Legacy, where game 1, you're starting very simply, but then we're going to pile on the complexity and also maybe increase the challenge as you're going along as well. So as you get better at this game, we're going to pile it on. Do you think there can be systems like that, or do you think it's let the players move at their own pace?
Well, clearly you can design systems like that. Complexity was never really a goal with Pandemic Legacy. What we were really doing is increasing the number of options that were available, so that players could kind of choose their own path. And we unlock lots of options so that you can kind of respond to the challenges that we're giving to you. And then some additional complexity is required, because we need variability. because you don't want to play the same game, like 18 times.
Yeah.
But the key there was providing a nice ramp. So you play it, and the first game is basically Pandemic. There's very, very little that's different. And then we changed it a little bit, and so it's never quite overwhelming. You get into an overwhelming situation when you put it on the shelf and you come back to 2 months later, and you're like, oh my gosh, what were all these rules? I can't remember all of them. And then you get some hiccups there.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because that was something I was just thinking in my head is, whenever we put the game down for a while, it was hard. Like, it wasn't hard learning it all at once. And actually, Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle is the same thing. Mm-hmm. Like, as you're increasing the amount of stuff that gets put into the game, it's fine if you're playing back to back to back. And I think maybe that's part of the reason for Pandemic Legacy success. I think you had a lot of people that really binged it. I mean, binging TV is popular now, but if anybody put it down, they realized why you want to binge it, right? Because coming back to it is much harder. Thankfully, you have the stickers in the rule book where, that part of it makes it easier, and we're doing a little bit more of that with Pandemic Legacy Season 2. Mm-hmm. We're putting it on the shelf for a little bit, and we come back, and it's nice having the rule book expand as the game comes out, because when you first get the game, there's not a lot of complexity there. In the rule book, you're reading it, and it's, something that's easily digestible. Yeah. And then as you go back to review it, you just kind of have to review the new parts, right?
Oh, you just look for the sticker wells and read those.
Exactly. So you know the basics. I don't know if that was a intentional decision, but it seems to work out better where, you can look where...
Not only that, but with Season 2, we tried to externalize the rules even more so there's more stickers that actually go on the board. So there are certain times in Season 1 that we learned were a little difficult for people to remember. And so whenever we encountered a pattern like that in 2, we put a reminder on the board, so it was very salient. Try to put it in the area where you would actually physically be moving your hand or whatever, so that you could remember those rules.
Yeah, now I've found Season 2 to be very smooth, even with a 2 or 3 week hiatus, because not just the things on the board, but also on the reference cards, and then I can see which of them need a little bit more explanation. So yeah, we've had pretty much no trouble jumping right in. I want to ask you if you're willing to talk about it. I know the design's not finished yet, but I love Forbidden Island, love Forbidden Desert. How much can you talk about Forbidden Sky? Like, what are some challenges in general?
I can talk in general.
Sure.
I had a couple false starts with the game, actually.
Yeah.
I worked with 2 different co-designers on 2 different games, and I did one solitaire and developed them pretty far before ultimately killing it. Yeah. Each one of them, one after another. Because the tricky bit was making it different enough that, it was something you'd want while still, being in the series and feeling like it belonged. And so I really needed to find an audience for the game, because I don't want the one to cannibalize the other. Like, oh, well, we got Sky, so we need Desert.
Yeah, Sky Fires, Forbidden Island or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was really sensitive to that.
Sure.
So part of the deal with that was finding some way to set it apart so that you could describe it as a different experience, very crisply to people. Like, oh, you want this one because of X, while this one is great because of Y. And that was very, very simple with Island and Desert. Island is sort of like the gateway game, get people in, no experience required, and Desert is a little crunchier. So this one, that was what led to a lot of the false starts, and just trying to make sure it was something I could really get behind.
Well, and Island and Desert are fabulously different. I mean, not just the island sinking and the sand piling, but the equipment cards, all the crunchy bits, like you're saying, the water, the caves, the tunnel systems, and the sunlight, and everything. I mean, it's great.
Yeah. So what else can I tell you about it? I can tell you a little bit about it. Right. I mean, so in Forbidden Island, the deal is the tiles in the game are disappearing as you play. That's a big thing. And in Desert, they're shifting around and the sand is building up, so you got shifting tiles. So we want to do something different with the tiles. So this is a bit of an exploration game. You're building the tiles as you're exploring.
Oh, cool.
Something.
Yeah. Sounds exciting.
Anyway, so you'll be doing different things there, and then...
So will you be adding to the board similar to
the board will
style?
grow kind of Carcassonne style.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah, but you'll be, unlike Carcassonne, you'll have your pawn kind of wandering around. And I think that's about all I can talk about at this point.
That is enough
we'll be
get
leaking
me
out more
even more
information
excited,
as the time goes by. Yeah.
All right, so building out the board, and you're obviously searching for something, and...
You're in the sky?
Well, there you go. Here you go. You heard it here first, folks. You will be in the sky.
So would you mind talking a bit about false starts? Because as I'm sure all designers have, we've had our share of that. What's been I guess with the recent ones or other ones in the past, kind of dealing with the demoralization and just moving on, picking yourself up.
Yeah, I mean, you hit this sort of point where you're like, is it good enough? And it just kind of comes from my gut. I'm really excited about it because I have to be excited about it. I have to want to pitch it and want to play it, and because I'm going to be playing it, well over 100 times, and I'm going to be with it for a year or longer. And then there's the game's been published, and you want to support it. People ask all sorts of questions on the Geek, and you want to be able to be there for them if they get stuck. So the things have a lifespan to them. And it's a longer lifespan than you might think,
And isn't it funny how sometimes you reach situations where you don't even know the answer to the question? And especially if you've been away from the game long enough and you're on to the next project, you're like, wait a minute, the island sinks? What?
Yeah. I mean, what's great about Geek is that a lot of the people have played it more than I have and actually know the rule book better than I do. Because I'll get questions and I'll have to go look it up sometimes. Just
Absolutely.
because, I got over a dozen games now and I have to go make sure. Because I don't want to say the wrong thing. If I contradict the rule book, God help me. That's the worst kind of thing ever.
Especially when it's in print and you are the designer.
Yeah, that's horrible.
It's like that Leacock said that you're playing it wrong.
Yeah, that's horrible. So I don't want to splinter the player community. Like, oh, these people play this way and these people play that way.
Right.
I hate that as a player. So
it's like the great schism. Like some view the grand Leacock as the master of the game.
Well, and part of it as a designer too is that you've played through different iterations of the game, so you don't even know what rules in the book sometimes. You definitely have to look it up. Anytime we get a question on the Geek, same thing. I'm like, I'm not home. Do you have a rule book near you? Like, what was our intention there? What did we settle in on? Like, I don't know.
So getting back to the Geek, I mean, a lot of people will respond correctly and they'll respond quickly.
Yeah.
And so I'm generally there in case, there's some sort of unresolvable problem where, I haven't ruled on something.
Or just to say, Bob's right.
Well, yeah, that's right.
And move
quote
on.
them and say, yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, now that is interesting. So as a designer, and obviously your games are very popular, so you have a lot of people that have played them and a lot of people responding. What is your thought on responding to people on the Geek as far as not necessarily criticisms, but more rules questions, things like that? Do you think it's better to let the player base somewhat police that for a little bit, and then, like, if nobody comes up with an answer within a day or two, then you respond? Or do you think it's a designer's responsibility to kind of get on there right away and, as best they can, answer those questions?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just a question of bandwidth. I mean, I just can't reply to every question, and I can't read every session log. I do scan just about everything that I subscribe to, and I subscribe to all my games.
Right.
So, I mean, it'll go by my eyes if only for a few seconds. And generally speaking, the community is really good at answering the questions. So I typically try to get involved only if people are like, hey, it's a he said, she said. They just can't work it out, and then I'll come in there and respond to it. And unfortunately, that's a good motivator for quality too, right? The more you can the more you can stress test the rules and get them clear up front, the less kind of those questions you've got. But inevitably, especially in legacy games, there are things that that are unclear, or something's packaged wrong, or you make a mistake. I mean, people are human. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to open the wrong thing, the wrong order.
Oh yeah,
it's wonderful for people. I just love the fact that people be like, I can't find this card, or I ripped it up accidentally. Does anybody have the contents of this card? And people are there for them, and that's great, because I don't have the bandwidth to answer all of those. And
right.
Yeah, so we brought up Pandemic Legacy a few times. I'm just curious on your thoughts of the sort of recent trend, I'd say. Of course, there are older kind of disposable games like Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective, and those kind of things. But what do you think of like these escape the room games, or games that you might only play once, or like Pandemic Legacy, you get maybe 12 plays or 16 plays out of it. I mean, clearly you've designed some, so I imagine you're a fan, but...
Well, I mean, I'm not necessarily a fan of like having to throw away a game or recycle it.
Well,
but,
fair enough.
I think there's a trade-off there. I mean, because it heightens the tension. There's no going back, and that creates this visceral emotional experience that I watched firsthand. It's really powerful. And then you can do the calculus and say, well, I played that for 20 hours and it spent so much. And I've never heard anybody complain after they finished the campaign that it wasn't of value. I mean, because most folks don't play a game 5 times, right?
Sure.
A lot of games sit in the shrink. So we ask a lot of people to, if you're going to finish the campaign, it's like 16, 18 games. That's a pretty big ask.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
if someone finishes
especially these days, as we said, how many games get played twice?
They're not
once?
complaining that they can't play it again. Usually, I mean, if they do, then they'll build a reset kit or what have you. But we've deliberately not pursued that, because then we can really go for it. We can say, well, how can we take this to the limit? That's just sort of the sandbox that we've set for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, the reset kit for Pandemic Legacy would be a new Pandemic Legacy.
Well, that's what it is.
Now, people are very creative. creative, and
get the other color.
If you want to laminate your stuff, go for it. I mean, I have no problem with that. If you want to do that, it's a lot of labor, but if you've got more time than money, then knock yourself out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I get, we've reviewed a lot of these sort of escape the room games just to pick on those for a minute. And there is a big difference for me. Some of the games are literally disposable. Like you've teared up and cut out and written on pieces of the game, and there's nothing to be done with it. The reason we like the Unlock series, for example, and Deckscape, is that at least, because like right now, as you said, like what's the play, or the hours to cost ratio? These games are usually an hour long and are like $15, $20, $25, and that's not a good ratio. At least compared to other board games, compared to maybe movie tickets for you and 3 of your friends, not too bad of a comparison. But the nice thing with the ones that you don't have to throw away is that you can pass it on to your friends. Right. You can trade it on to somebody else on the Geek. You can donate it to an auction. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. So the game carries on. Very different than to a game that's just ripped up and written on that only gets one play out of it. That's very...
I mean, I've played both the Unlock and I played Exit. Just one of each. I mean, I enjoyed the Exit experience, but it didn't feel like I was like tearing it up completely. It was like just enough components that I couldn't reuse it.
Yeah, exactly. That's how they get you. That's sort
of right on the edge. I mean, it was fine for me. I enjoyed it. I thought I got my money's worth, but I know what you're talking about.
Sure.
Yeah. So now right away, the first thing we do is like rip up the rule book for it, like that book, so everybody can get their own page or whatever. Because that is one potential problem with games like this, and we could talk about this as in co-ops in general, where you have one puzzle that you're working on at a time. Everybody's working on the same puzzle, especially if it's something that's visual. Seventh Continent has this as well. Every tile you flip over has some visual, or not everyone, but
many of them have hidden numbers that if you don't see them, you can't progress to like special parts of the island. Yeah.
And so part of that is only one person can look at that at a time, though. So you need to have stuff for the other people to do. So I guess as just a co-op designer in general, how do you try to integrate everybody in the gameplay experience? Because co-ops are a very much group experience at the same time. So have you ever run up to challenges like that? And
I guess it kind of jumps into Alpha Gamer as well. Like they're different problems, but related problems. Yeah, how do you keep everyone involved? How do you keep everyone's voice and choices meaningful?
Sure. Yeah, well, unlike these escape room type things, it's less prop driven, so you're not scanning for a given number. You're all sitting around the table, and there's plenty. I mean, it's a distributed computing problem, right? The thing is complex enough that if you're going to play optimally, more minds are going to be better than fewer. And I know this because I've sold a lot of my games, and I've determined that I am better with more people, because more people are challenging me on my assumptions. So my win ratio is lower by myself. So,
that's great.
I mean, I can talk all about alpha gaming and it being a social problem, but there are also things you can do as a game designer to try to mitigate that somewhat. And one of those things, like having your own materials that only you can control. And we're careful to say, with permission, you may move thereupon. You watch people just not even have those basic
you're going here.
Decency. Yeah, you're going here. And
you're going to put out this fire. Your character's going to die here, but hey, it's okay.
The one thing I can't stand is when people are referred to in the third person when they're at the table. I'm like, come on. She's
Johnny,
right there.
Johnny's doing this.
Yeah, right. Oh, God.
Yeah, and it is interesting because I know, Peter and I game a lot together, and we really don't have this problem. And so I understand the concern, especially with games like where your hand is face up, and theoretically there's more possibility for alpha gaming. And I personally find it, I totally think you should design at least something in there, like some kind of information or choice or whatever, or complexity that makes alpha gaming not an issue. But at the same time, I see this on the Geek a lot. People are like, is there something that makes Alpha Gamer impossible? Then I'm not playing it. And I'm like, what? Every co-op game, like even if you have a hand, I might be like, hey, if you have a green card, play it here. It doesn't matter. Yeah. No matter what you do, somebody could be an alpha gamer if that's their personality, if that's how the group is working, like the dynamic there. So
I think it's very similar to playing a game with mismatched skill levels.
Yeah.
Like if you're a grandmaster playing against a less experienced chess player, it's not going to be a good game because there's going to be such a discrepancy in skill, and it's unfair to ask people sitting around the table with different levels of expertise to have the same level of enjoyment as a group of people who are all relatively around the same skill level and can all contribute as equals. It's not to say that you should be rude. It's saying that it's a lot to ask of a game to say that everybody's going to have exactly the same fun, when you're playing it.
And if they are, it's probably a very simplistic game, right?
Yeah, or it's just not a purely cooperative game where you're all contributing ideas freely, right? So. You can do it, though. I mean, I know people who have played Season 1 multiple times with new groups, and it's like watching, a second series of a TV show with your friends. You're not going to say, hey, guess what happens next? And,
right.
and you tell them, they're going to hate you, so... but I was going to get back to staying involved in the game, and some things that I put in the pandemic early on, because I saw this, I want people to be involved when it's not their turn. Just the fact that you have an event card that you can play at any time. Mm-hmm. If you have one of those, you're responsible for knowing when the right time to play it is. So if it's not your turn, you have to pay attention, if nothing else, than to be paying attention to the loop. Should I play that card now? Should I play that card now? And so that's one of the reasons why those things are so flexible. It's just to keep people with those cards involved all the time.
Yeah, and actually, now that you mention it, I see that in a lot of your designs, because Island has the sandbags, especially the helicopter, since you might move somebody else on their turn to make their actions so much more efficient. So, definitely.
There's a further refinement with those in that it's like an event card, but you own it, so only you can play it, and it affects you personally, but they're transferable. So you're like, okay, I can give this to you. It's this token that you can move around.
Yeah, so that's a great design choice there. I never thought about it that specifically, but really nice.
Cool. Well, we've kind of covered the gambit. Actually, before we close out here, I do want to talk about, you're talking about alpha player. What I've seen sometimes too, and you talked about the different skill levels, is somebody who's new to a game sometimes shut down. So I see that more than I see an alpha player when I've played in groups. So what do you do for that person, right? What do you do for the person that's like, I don't know, what do you think I should do? You know what I mean? Yeah, you get that, like, I don't know what to do. You've played this before, I mean, is there anything we as designers can do, any tools we can give that new player to make them have a little bit more agency themselves?
That's a good question. I don't have a pat answer, or a quick answer for that. I mean, I think as players, we can be trying to be more respectful and say, well, here's some options, and then defer to them to make the choice. I mean, as an experienced player, you might point out several intelligent options, but then, leave it to the current player, the new player's intuition as to which one they might want to choose.
What I do like a lot that some games have done, I'm bringing up Spirit Island a few times, but Spirit Island did it, and also like a lot of like war games and things will do this, not cooperative per se, but they'll have like suggested unit lists, or in Spirit Island they have a set of like the progression, so you don't even have to draw powers, just get these powers, they're marked with the symbol, and this is how you will progress in your first game. So the nice thing about it is that you can play with very experienced players and just have those cards ready, and it takes out the most challenging, not like the most interesting, like you still get to do the very interesting, tactical game management stuff, but it takes out one of the most kind of complex, like icon-driven stuff from the game so that you can jump right in, and the experienced players don't even have to spend time being like, that's the one you want.
All right, yeah.
So I think something along those lines... either your friends or the designer giving you like suggested choices, suggested starting roles, whatever you want to do.
Right, that's what I was going to say. You could potentially design roles that are a little bit more straightforward.
Sure.
But still fun to play.
Like I think the first time I played Pandemic, I probably had the medic, and that was super simple and super straightforward. Yeah. And I felt awesome. I was just going around curing everything.
Probably better than, say, the contingency expert.
Exactly. Or, oh my gosh, the worst. Who's the person who can move other people? The
dispatcher.
Yeah, like...
with their permission.
Yeah.
Like they would give the dispatcher to a new player and be like, hey, so we're going to tell you what to do with your actions.
Yeah.
So I want to be over here. Point. Can you get me there?
Right.
Well, and it's funny because we did something with Salvation Road when we designed it. We had one character. We wanted somebody who could give actions to another player, but we gave them the ability to move to their location and then let them have an action so they select their own action. So it's like, hey, I'm moving here. Go ahead and take an action. And now that person's involved again when it's not their turn. So I think there are things you can do with that as well, where even if you have a role, that would be typically I'm going to give all my actions to everybody else, and you can't, I'm not going to do anything on my turn. It at least gives people, a benefit out of it and something you can do. Yeah, it's an
interesting idea, because at the front of mine, you typically have a section that's pretty short, but it says, here's the difficulty level you probably want to set for the group. But I don't really have anything that says, hey, are you a new player? Or if you have new players in your group, maybe have them play this role or that role.
Yeah, it's interesting anyway, and I know some games do it, and they have like complexity levels against the bosses they're fighting, complexity levels of like Sentinels of the Multiverse is the one I think of. Like this character is really easy to use. This one's not so straightforward. Like expect a harder game because you're not going to know what you're doing. And
Well, there you go, Matt. Tell game right for Forbidden Sky. Here are the roles that are suggested for new players.
If you see it in the game, you'll know where it came from.
Hey, we'll be slightly minorly famous, kind of.
No one's going to hear this, so it's fine. There's no proof anywhere.
All right. Well, Matt, it has been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And thanks so much for taking time out of Unpub. I know it's a busy weekend for you. You're the keynote, right? Like the guest of honor.
Guest of honor, I think.
Yeah, whatever they call it.
All of the above.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right, great. Thanks for your time, Matt.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of CoOp Cast. We'll be back in 2 weeks to review another cooperative board game. Until then, please review us on iTunes. And while you're there, check out Mindless Faith. They provide our bumper music. Also, if you like co-op games, and why else would you be here, check out coopboardgames.com. They have some great cooperative board game material. If you want to contact us, feel free to follow us on Twitter at MVPBoardGames or email us at mvpboardgames@gmail.com.
Shifting point where you are...
You want to re-edit
Should have locked the door. Yeah, and it's interesting to me, though. I totally lost it. Wasn't that interesting to me, apparently.
It would have been, man. We just never got to hear it, see?
I had it halfway through.
Maybe it was the most interesting thing you were going to say.
It was the most interesting part of this whole discussion, and I totally lost it.
Bye. And in the immortal words of Bill and Ted, be excellent to each other.